One day in 2004, a young man was eating breakfast and watching the local news when suddenly this story about a savage murder came on. Now, at first, the young man actually wasn't paying all that much attention to the story, in part because this murder happened pretty far away from where he lived, about 100 miles away. But at some point on the news, the picture of the murder victim flashed across the screen. And when he saw it, he just froze. And for a minute, that's all he did. He just stared at the screen, could not believe what he was seeing. He put his food down and then he rushed over to his computer. He fired it up and immediately began searching through the chat log of an old conversation he had had. And after scrolling for a little while, he eventually found what he was looking for. And at that point, he printed out the entire chat log and rushed to go show the police. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please go over to the follow button's house and proceed to eat all their food in their fridge, but put back all the empty containers. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of June 3rd, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri. His friends were already there. They were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, and as soon as they saw him, they waved him over. And so Jesse made his way over to sit with them. Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri, and he was majoring in journalism and pre-law. The spring semester had just ended a few weeks ago, and as much as Jesse had loved the semester and he really had enjoyed what he was studying, he was looking forward to some time off. He wanted to see his friends and go to some good parties. Jesse had always been a very outgoing person with a very active social life, but sometimes that characteristic sort of got him in trouble. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, he had to go to court over a charge of obstructing a government operation, which he picked up 2 months earlier when he refused to leave a house party that the cops were breaking up. And as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him, like, "Hey, how'd that court hearing go?" And Jesse had said, it didn't go too well. He thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, and he had hoped the charge would have been dropped already. But when he had gone to the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was worse. But Jesse said, he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty and his plan was to fight this thing to the very end, even if it took all summer. However, the reality was this charge was actually the least of Jesse's problems. He had much bigger things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently, and he was having a very hard time coping with that. Jack had wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though, the intention was good, it just made things harder for Jesse, because it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending quite a bit of time together and still talking and socializing. And while Jack felt like things were over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way. It just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even though they weren't. And then whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about, maybe trying to make things work again, Jack would immediately just turn him down. And so the whole situation was just really difficult. And so without Jack anymore, Jesse had become very lonely. And he had been trying to fill that void with random hookups, meeting guys online and inviting them to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk. But for the most part, it was sort of shallow and didn't mean anything. At one point, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting. But deep down, what Jesse really wanted was just a real relationship like he had with Jack, and these random hookups were not that. And so at this point, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing, he was always kind of on the hunt for somebody who could potentially have, long-term relationship potentially have. And this night was no exception. And so that night, Jesse and his friends had a nice dinner together, and then when they were done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks to a gay dance club called Soho Club. It was dark and the music was loud and thumping. And as soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor over to the DJ booth. He asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, and the DJ just sort of rolled their eyes. Jesse knew the DJ was very likely annoyed with him because Jesse requested that song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse never had let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. And so he didn't care, he just wanted the song played. And so after he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he waited, he saw a young man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse went over and asked the man if he wanted to dance. The man smiled and said, "Sure." And then one dance turned into two, turned into three, and pretty soon the two had spent the whole night together. Now, it was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDavid and he was training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate connection. And so when the club closed, Jesse asked if Ed wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes, and after that, Jesse asked his friend Jennifer if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to Jesse's apartment. She said, of course. And so shortly after that, the trio left the club, they got in Jennifer's car, and they drove back to Jesse's apartment. And when Jesse and Ed got out, Jennifer said, "Hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by." And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, "Yeah, hopefully we'll both be there." And then Jennifer drove off. After Jennifer had driven off, Jesse walked Ted down the stairs to his very rundown basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed saw the sea of all these history books stacked all over the living room. It would turn out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history, and so Ed began walking around, opening up all these old history books. And as Ed did, Jesse began regaling him with, tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, how the Spartans were outnumbered and how they prevailed, and talking about Zeus and the ancient Greek gods and just kind of going off on all the stuff that Jesse really enjoyed about, ancient Greek history. And Ed, as he listened to it, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. And so from there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would spend the night together, and then attend. Zorro, and the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper and then walked Ted to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then once he was gone, Jesse just hoped that, maybe this wasn't just a meaningless hookup, but maybe this had the basis of a strong, long-term relationship, the one thing Jesse really wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was eating a quick lunch before heading out for work when he heard a knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway, and his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, "Hey, it's the 4th of the month and you still haven't paid rent." Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind, and he promised he would get it to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach because the truth was, he didn't have the money. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his whole family to go to college, and he had paid his bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family and he spoke to them basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left and tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who can do anything and go anywhere. And so even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find, but it still wasn't enough to make rent. He dropped the cash in the landlord's mailbox anyway with a note promising he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then, he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent an uneventful evening behind the front desk. counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the end of his shift came, when the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted home and immediately changed clothes before heading out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDavid. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he didn't see Ed. He did a lap around the apartment checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and began chatting with Jennifer while he waited. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really late or he just was not coming. So, trying to tell himself that it was not quite time to be disappointed. Maybe there was an explanation here. Jesse went outside and called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone, and so Jesse, he punched it in and he listened. And it rang for a few beats and then somebody picked up. And it was a guy, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was MrBallen, and Jesse had never heard of this guy. And he asked, "Where's Ed?" And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate, and that actually Ed was asleep right now. He had to work in the morning, and so he had decided, actually, not to go to the party, to Jennifer's party, He just wanted to sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of, okay, is Mark like Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together or are they just roommates? And also Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to Jesse right now. It was pretty clear in his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone. But Jesse was not ready to just, mail it in here. He wanted to see Ed, and so he told Mark, "Well, hold on a minute. Can you please go wake him up? I need to talk to him." And at first Mark was like, "No, he's asleep. He has work in the morning. He does not want me waking him up." But Jesse was relentless and just begged Mark to please, just for a second, put him on the phone. And eventually Mark relented. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone. And as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited and he basically pitched Ted hard on why he should not go to bed and come out to this party. And that he really wanted to see him, and also, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, "Fine, I'll come out and meet you and I will bring Mark." When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2:00 a.m. At that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party across the street. At around 3:00 a.m. though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, he had to get up in the morning, he had to go. And so at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk and then asked him if, "Hey, do you want to come over to my place?" But Ed said, "No, really. I have to get home. I have to go to bed." However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer, and then after that, he began making the walk to his own apartment. And as he was making the short walk to his own place, he began to think that he didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. And so Jesse called Jack a few times, and when Jack did not pick up, after all, it's 3:00 in the morning and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't. But at that point, Jesse still wanted to see him. And so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment. Jesse went right up to the door and banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, Jesse began to wonder if, maybe Jack's out with somebody else right now, and he suddenly felt so jealous. Or worse, maybe Jack is here and he knows I'm here, but he doesn't want to see me and he's ignoring me. After a couple of minutes of standing there, unknocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from Jack, Jesse finally gave up and stumbled back to his own apartment. Drunk and lonely and a bit heartbroken, Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:00 a.m. However, right after he'd gotten undressed and flopped down on his bed, he heard a knock at the front door at 2:00 p.m. the following day. So Saturday, June 5th, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building, and they were carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled into the parking lot, and they were about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now at first he assumed, this was just somebody passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia Police Detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping crowds of worried neighbors away from this crime scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. It was a young man sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts with no shoes, no socks, and no shirts. And across his throat was this very deep gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body. And she told Detective Short that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, their arms, and their torso. But when she lifted the victim's hands, there were no defensive wounds on them. She told Short that that was pretty unusual for a knife attack where the victims usually got their hands up, trying to defend themselves. And as a result, they got their hands cut up. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and pooled under his body. But there was no blood at all on the front of his body, which meant he was probably lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Short the hemorrhaging in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so, putting it all together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out and then laid him on the grass and then slit his throat while he was laying there unconscious, unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt, like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began on the lawn where the body was found. And now, he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here and that this was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no id on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he'd been running from. And so Short stood up and stepped away from the body so crime scene techs could load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up and 2 more officers got out, Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this neighborhood. So another sergeant on scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. And Rios came over and he looked inside. And after a second, he said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he'd actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good guesses about how his victim was killed. His next task was figuring out who might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So Short looked up Jesse's address and he found his apartment building was only a block away. So he walked over there and, while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, an officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went, until the crime scene was officially cleared. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's unit, and there the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they'd arrived, the door was actually already open. And so Short went inside the actual unit and began looking around. There was no blood anywhere and nothing was broken or overturned, so there was no clear sign of a struggle. But the door being left open suggested that Jesse must have left in a hurry, and this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and his killer starting in one location and ending on the lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so, as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer likely was pretty strong and pretty fast. So we're talking about somebody who is in relatively good shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he's developed in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed kind of personal, which suggested that whoever killed Jesse likely was somebody Jesse actually knew. And so with that in mind, Short finished a sweep of Jesse's apartment and then asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the self-owned computer that he saw on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder and wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this, but then it was like this look of realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night, he had actually woken up to the sound of, very clearly, to grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was clearly Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No one stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly said, they didn't actually do anything about this. They actually just kind of banged on their own wall and said, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped it over there. And the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and gone to sleep, not realizing what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when they had woken up that afternoon, he'd actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was open, and he didn't look inside. He felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the open door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door. And so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about their business. And so, after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with, but the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all, so he did not know who this other person was. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information, then he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin in Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment late at night, like that night. Was this somebody who was a friend? A love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and did spur to fight? He didn't know. But who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs at Jesse's cell phone, and he was holding it in the air like he had found something. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet, but they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs. And the tech told Short that there was something in there that he definitely wanted to see, because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Barry 7 times between 3 and 3, 0 and 3:18 that morning. So right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Barry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's, and so he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered, and he had very red, puffy eyes like he'd clearly been crying. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see the detective. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news. A friend had told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was, in fact, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend and Jesse had kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jesse. Jack said the night before, he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over and over again, and before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door. And he saw it was the middle of the night, and then he leaned over and saw the caller was Jesse, and he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me. It's very likely him at the front door. I don't want to see him right now. And so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope he went away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind, like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying at the time, Jesse was killed. I was home alone by myself, which was pretty weak. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in the alibi, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon, and during that phone call, Jesse had told him about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before, and his name was Ed McDavid. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDavid through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed, but there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster. Because Columbia was a college town where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and, staff of the university really wanted Short to get this thing done. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. I mean, after all, Ed was shaking and fidgety looking. He seemed sort of like an emotional wreck, which could mean, no. Of course he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim, That's traumatic. Or it could mean he's hiding something and now he's about to be interrogated by the police, something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11:00 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3:00 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk still very alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to his apartment at 3:00 a.m., and Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story and asked a few follow-up questions, and then also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this, search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure and looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, and he discovered in the police department's system that there was Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who'd seen Jesse that night, and obviously, Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out the gate that he did not like Jesse, and actually, he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3. I saw him, just like Ed had said. But Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own, and he actually didn't know what time he got back. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so obviously something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample and added Mark to the suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they'd all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse apparently had been hounding his ex-boyfriend, Jack, about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want. And the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door and announced, it just seemed like harassment. So it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things got out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup, and some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing, the two would remain friends. So it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that, somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDavid, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while searching Ed's house, they'd found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were argent sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past and openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he died, but they'd only met one time and, very likely, they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him, like Jordan. And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like something was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner and told him a tip had just come in, and it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps, even amongst the investigators. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse, at one point, had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man, and this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, June 6, 2004. 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so, whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were the most likely suspect because, unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line, because they clearly were carrying on this totally illicit affair while on duty. You know, that's not okay. And also they were using their position and power, potentially, to actually land this relationship. And then also on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very carefully here, because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every officer he passed, and he realized there wasn't a single person here he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat at his desk, and pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already, and he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had told them about this cop he was sleeping with, and one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so, when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it, and he discovered, out of the 200 officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the name Anderson, Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. And so the next step was trying to figure out if either of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at the house party back in April. And as he flipped through it, he realized Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found the killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually, he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here, because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then, as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him and showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then, after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest, and Brad nodded and said, "Yeah." He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving, and that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence, but just then Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by Bios. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he was like, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about, Jesse being his gay lover, but Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal. Because even though, again, it was terrible in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there's truth there. Maybe Rios knows that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not, aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all 3 of them just kind of went their separate ways, and Short, hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary, and she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she led in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend, and he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3:00 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in shining a flashlight. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom and he joined them for a threesome. And then after they were done, the cop told Andy, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. I mean, the final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook and told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "What do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, well, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of June 5th, 2004. Around 3:00 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after work. And then just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no strings attached, late-night secret hookup. But when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse told the killer that he had figured out they were married, and so now he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see him anymore. But when he told the killer to leave and the killer refused, Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. So in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped an arm around his neck, and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then the killer laid Jesse out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. And then on the way home, the killer very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring nobody would ever find it, because they knew the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to the front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then, just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag on their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name, and in fact, he actually stole the name tag, not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson, Ted Anderson. He was using his name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse. Rios was arrested in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, but after an appeal, he got a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Today's podcast will feature 3 horror stories that are pure nightmare fuel. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Face, and it's about a mother and daughter who spot a lost child on the side of the road while driving home at night. The second story you'll hear is called Just Teeth, and it's about a gruesome discovery made on a farm. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Hell on High Water, and this story has been told many times through history. But this original version I'm about to share is by far the creepiest because it really happened. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get the follow button a nice fresh cup of coffee. But don't tell them you made the coffee using hot dog water. Okay, let's get into our first story called Face. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small, rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot, and this highway was pretty desolate. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway, and it was just thick forest on both sides of the road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently focused on the road. But at night, her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so, she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now, Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to setting, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so, as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window that it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. "What's a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" she says to her mom. "I think I just saw a little girl." And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She's just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, "I think I just saw a little girl. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay." And so Misty's mom looks over at her, and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's going to be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, "Did you really see someone? 'Cause we got to get home." And Misty's like, "Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back." And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now they had only made it about a half-mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl, and so pretty quickly they slowed down because Misty said, "I think she's in this area." And they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's going to be now that they turned around. Now it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light and they had headlights. They were pretty confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so, as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road, she had her knees tucked up to her chest, and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here all. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's no houses, there's no buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would even be out here, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just doctor past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so, as they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but she was not a young child. And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her. Considering there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road, you should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge that. She just continued to have her knees up to her, ease up to her chest and rock back and forth. And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they doctor past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house. Now she wasn't their house. Now she wasn't their house anymore. But there were no street lights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left. But there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen this girl, and they were coming up to this four-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped, because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up to the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic, and she said to her mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by the situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. And so, even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to at least doctor past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl. But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat. And she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going, don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl, who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road, She's got her knees up, she's rocking back and forth. She's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat. She rolls the window down. And Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears. And she's crying, and she opens her eyes and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat. And her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell and she's looking at her mom and she's like, what's happening? What just happened? What did you say? And her mom's got her hand over her mouth and she's speeding down the road, and she's crying now. And she's looking at Misty and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, what did you see? What happened? And finally, her mother just said she didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was very vocal about it. Oh. It was very vocal about it. Oh. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me. And so Misty screams and she's crying. And her mom is crying and they speed home. They're home just a couple minutes later and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911. And she didn't even know how to describe what she just saw. But she knew it was too embarrassing to try it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl. Our next story is called Just Teeth. At around 7 p.m. on September 25th, 2012, a 16-year-old farmer named Terry Garner stepped out of his house in rural Oregon to go feed his animals. He stopped first at his enclosed yard, where he spread some seed on the ground for his chickens and turkeys. And then he headed over to his pen where he was raising for horned goats, which are goats that grow for horns instead of two. And after picking up some hay and tossing it in with the goats, Terry just stood there and smiled as he watched the animals eat. Terry loved his animals. He actually had previously been a butcher for most of his life, but 6 years earlier when he had retired, he had kind of gone the opposite direction, basically housing all these animals and treating them basically like people. In fact, he was so devoted to his animals that sometimes when the nearby river would flood, he would move all of his animals into this house he had built on his property just for the animals to make sure they were safe. And if you ever went to visit Terry at his property, it was pretty common to see a lot of the chickens and other birds just kind of hanging out on the front porch of Terry's house. He didn't care. He liked having them around. But of all the creatures that Terry took care of at his farm, the animal he loved the most were his pigs. Now normally, when farmers raise pigs, they grow them to about 250 to 300 pounds and then they sell them to butchers to be slaughtered. But that's obviously not what Terry was doing here. He loved these pigs so much that he basically just fed them anytime they were hungry. And they were hungry all the time, which meant his pigs sometimes grew to be like 700 pounds. And at no point was Terry going to sell those pigs. He just wanted his pigs to live their best life. So on this morning, after he was done feeding his chickens and turkeys and the goats, he grabbed a whole bunch of food and began making his way over to his beloved pigs. A few hours later, a member of Terry's family arrived at Terry's property and knocked on his door. This family member had called Terry earlier in the day and Terry hadn't picked up. Now, that in and of itself was not that uncommon. Terry was a busy farmer, but Terry always called people back and so far he hadn't. And so, this family member was here just to check on him and make sure he was okay. And so after a few minutes, when Terry did not come to the door, the family member grew more concerned about Terry and decided they would just walk the whole property and just go find Terry and see what he was doing. And so the family member left the porch and walked all around the property. They saw where the chickens and turkeys were, they saw the goats, they saw the pigs, but that was it. All they saw were animals. Terry was nowhere to be found. It was like he was gone. And so, the family member was just about to turn around and head back to Terry's house to see if, maybe he really wasn't there, when suddenly something caught their eye in the pig pen. Now at first, what they were looking at just seemed impossible, like, how could that be there? That doesn't make any sense. But when the family member walked over and got a closer look, they knew for sure what they were looking at. And as soon as that truth sunk in, they turned, ran to the house, and called the police. It would turn out earlier that morning, when Terry had walked into the pig pen to feed his beloved, enormous pigs, somehow or another he had wound up on the ground. Now, we don't know if he had a heart attack, or if he had some other medical event, or if he simply just tripped and couldn't get up again. But one way or another, he wound up on the ground and at some point his pigs devoured him. And so what that family member saw in the mud that caught their eye was not Terry, but Terry's false teeth grinning back at him. Those teeth, along with several pieces of his body and his clothes, were all that was left of Terry. One more haunting detail of this case is that officials were not able to actually figure out whether or not Terry was dead before he began being eaten, or if he was just sort of incapacitated and very much alive when his beloved pigs began to eat him. The next and final story of today's episode is called Hell on High Water. One evening in the middle of March of 1907, a sailor named Nels Nelson stood at the bow of this big Russian steamboat called the Parai, and he looked out over the Pacific Ocean with a very worried look on his face. The sun was starting to go down, and Nels was afraid of what the night might bring. About a month earlier, the Parai, the boat that Nels was on, had left Hong Kong and begun its long journey to California, where Nels and the rest of the crew would offload all their hempen machinery. And just that day, the Parai had passed by Honolulu, Hawaii, which meant they were nearly to their final destination. Now their long voyage thus far had been quiet, but now Nels just couldn't help feeling like their luck was about to run out. Nels had been a sailor his whole life. He was originally from Sweden, but he traveled all over the world, and a few years back, he had linked up with the Parai in Hong Kong. And now, other than the captain of the Parai, who was a Russian named Gubinsky, Nels was the longest-serving member on board the Parai. And what that meant was Nels and the ship's captain were the only two currently on board the Parai who knew the ship's dark secret. Now, Nels and the captain had not told anyone the secret and didn't intend to. Now, this wasn't something they planned, like, they weren't trying to keep it a secret instead. It was just kind of this unspoken agreement that we're just never going to talk about this. But at the last port in Hong Kong where the ship was docked, the previous entire crew of the Parai, minus Nels and the captain, had all deserted because of this secret. And so now Nels and the captain were left to kind of keep this information to themselves and go out and solicit a new crew to come on board the Parai to go to California. But they did it without telling these people about this dark secret. And they'd managed to do it. Nels and the captain had found this kind of ragtag bunch of sailors to come with them on this journey. But as a result of recruiting basically anybody with a pulse who was willing to go on this voyage, the crew they ultimately recruited was kind of an untrustworthy, sketchy bunch. On this night, it was Nels's turn to stand watch, which means basically you would stay up and kind of patrol the boat and look out for problems or emergencies. It was just a way to make sure the crew was always safe even when everybody was asleep. And even though Nels was not exactly thrilled to be staying up all night to stand watch, in a way he actually was kind of relieved to be in charge of this task. He figured he'd rather be awake and miserable than asleep and vulnerable. Suddenly another sailor came up to Nels, and Nels hadn't heard him, and the sailor slapped him on the back and said, "Hey, how you enjoying your sunset cruise tonight?" Nels turned around and saw it was another crew member just kind of pulling his leg. And so Nels attempted to put on a smile and kind of go along with the joke and make it kind of lighthearted, but he was really struggling, because he was looking off to the horizon and he could see the sun had nearly set. For the next couple of hours, Nels and this other sailor would stand by this railing in the cold night air, and they would just talk about, what they're gonna do when they get to California and, what they plan to do with their lives generally, and just kind of small talk, normal stuff. And for a little while, Nels did forget about all this extreme anxiety he was having about nighttime. But at some point, as Nels and this other sailor were just chatting away, there was this warm breeze that kind of came across the deck of the ship. Now remember, it had been very cold all night, and so this warm air really stood out. And the second Nels felt that warm air, he knew his worst fears were about to be realized. And so, Nels was so scared about what was about to happen that he just kind of froze. He couldn't even turn and tell his partner what was happening. And his partner was totally oblivious because his partner had never been on the Parai before and didn't know the ship's dark secret. And so, this other sailor just kept on blabbering away, totally oblivious. But then, as Nels is frozen to the spot with fear, from down below in the ship where the crew was all sleeping, they heard this loud guttural scream, like one of the crew members was being tortured or something. And right away, the guy next to Nels, the other sailor who had been with him, he stopped talking, cause now he knows there's a problem. He doesn't know what it is, but obviously something's wrong. Now Nels was still frozen with fear because he knows what's happening. He knows what's gonna happen. And so he was just standing there and the other sailor's like, "Nels, what's going on? We gotta go down there." But it wasn't until more screams began coming out of the berthing area down below that Nels kind of snapped out of it. And he was like, "All right, come on, we gotta go." And the two of them, they went bombing down the steps, down into the berthing area, and they went into the first compartment where these screams were coming from. And when Nels and his partner walked into this room, they looked and they saw two of their crew members were sitting on one of the bunks, just completely rigid, as if they were totally stiff. And the two of them were just screaming as loud as they possibly could in perfect unison. But it was like they weren't there. It's like their eyes were staring off into the distance and they couldn't control their bodies. Now Nels knew what was going on here, but the partner didn't. And so the partner's looking at Nels like, "What's going on here?" And Nels just turned to him and said, "Look, I think we can quarantine them. Help me move them." And so this partner has no idea what Nels is doing. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he kind of jumped into action with Nels. And Nels and this guy, they grabbed these screaming crew members who were totally stiff, and they remained stiff as nails, and the other sailor dragged them out of the room, down the hall, and they put them in what's called the hold, which is kind of like a jail cell on board a ship. It's where sailors who misbehave get sent to, and so it's a place you can put things, unlock the door, and they don't come out again. Nels' thinking was, if we can take these affected crew members and quarantine them in the hold, maybe, just maybe, this won't spread to the rest of the crew. But as soon as Nels had shut and locked those two men inside of the hold, it was like the entire ship erupted with screams as the entire crew, minus Nels and his partner, just began screaming like mad. It was like the ship was total chaos. And so Nels and the crew member, they began running down the hall, trying to figure out where the screaming was coming from. But before they knew it, the rest of the crew were streaming out of their rooms into the hallway, just screaming and running their way upstairs to the top deck. And so Nels began telling himself, stay calm. It's okay. It's not happening to you yet. But then it felt like someone had reached up inside of Nels' chest, squeezing as hard as they could. It was like his body was being possessed by something. And then he felt this pressure building up inside of him. And then it was like without even trying, suddenly the loudest scream that had ever come out of Nels came out of his mouth, and he was completely powerless to stop it. And seconds later, Nels screaming at the top of his lungs along with his partner, who was also screaming, they joined the stampede of other screaming crew members running their way up to the top deck. And when Nels and his partner reached the top deck, as they were screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming, Nels looked around and he took stock of what he was seeing. Again, he's literally screaming this entire time and can't stop it. And he's seeing that's what everybody else was dealing with. There were sailors who were clawing at their faces almost like they were trying to stop themselves from screaming, but that wasn't doing anything. Others were holding their throats, attempting to stop the screaming. Some others were running into walls and grabbing and fighting with each other. I mean, it was absolute chaos. And so Nels, he's kind of taking stock of this whole situation, still screaming, and then he notices one sailor in particular. And Nels knew exactly what was going to happen. That one sailor who Nels did not know well, he was one of the sketchy crew members who were picked up in Hong Kong. He stopped screaming. And Nels could tell because there was this look of absolute calm over the sailor's face, and he was down on all fours, almost like an animal, right out in the middle of the top deck. And Nels, as he continued to scream, watched as this young, now very quiet, the sailor started to move across the deck like an animal, and as he did, he got faster and faster, like he was galloping on all fours. And he was headed straight for the railing of the ship. Now Nels, in his conscious mind, he knew what was going to happen next and he wanted to stop it, but just like he couldn't stop his own screaming, he was powerless to stop what was about to happen to this young man. And sure enough, Nels watched in horror as this galloping young sailor went full speed to the railing and then just leapt clear over it and splashed into the water below. And the second he hit the water, it was like everybody on the ship broke out of their trance. The screaming stopped and it was eerily quiet. And one by one, each of the crew who had kind of broken out of their trance now began looking around, having no idea how they just wound up on the deck and what was even going on. And they looked at each other to try to figure out, like, do you know? Do you know what just happened? But nobody knew. And then this very tense silence was broken when one of the crew members who had seen that young man gallop and leap over the side. You know, this crew member, he yelled, "Hey, man overboard." Someone jumped over, and it was like that was the thing that everybody was going to focus on. We're going to forget about this absolute craziness that just happened, and we're going to try to rescue this guy. But despite lowering down rowboats and paddling around for nearly an hour, and yelling out for this guy and turning their ship around over and over again, they never found him. He never made a single noise, nothing. He just vanished into the night, and that was it. And so after about an hour of searching, the search was called off, and this sailor who had leapt over the edge was declared dead. And once he was declared dead, and the rest of the crew were all back on board the Parai, standing on the top deck looking around like, what just happened? Nels and the captain looked at each other and nodded, because they knew they would have to tell the crew what just happened. They would have to share the ship's dark secret. And so, Nels and the captain told the crew the big secret, and the crew was obviously horrified. But considering they had just been through the entire experience, they weren't exactly surprised. They just hoped that, this night was the only night this craziness would happen. But the following night, the same thing happened. Everybody screamed, went crazy, ran up to the deck. Somebody leapt overboard. The next night, same thing happened as well. The next night. So for nights in a row of this, the captain just could not take it anymore. And when he heard that first scream echo through the ship, the captain grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired. In early April, the Parai finally reached San Francisco, California, where the crew was supposed to offload their hempen machinery. By this point, one of the sailors whose name was Patamon had assumed command of the ship. But by this point, the crew were very close to mutiny. They did not want to be on the ship anymore. They didn't care who was in charge. And in fact, once the Parai got even just within sight of land, there were 9 sailors still on board the Parai who stole one of the rowboats, lowered it down to the water, and just paddled to land to get away from the Parai as fast as they could. But didn't even ask to be paid. They just wanted to get away. Nels and the few remaining crew members on board the Parai docked it in San Francisco, California. They unloaded the hemp, and then the crew actually got back on the Parai and set sail again and sailed to Santa Monica, California, which was not a very far distance, where they would offload the machinery, so the rest of their haul. And actually, on the morning that they were supposed to actually dock in Santa Monica, the crew's cook leapt overboard to his death at 2. And the crew barely reacted because, by this point, this was just commonplace on board the Parai, people going crazy and jumping over to their deaths. And so once the Parai was docked in Santa Monica and all the cargo was offloaded, Nels and the rest of the crew just left it there. They totally abandoned it and just left. And the Parai would remain totally abandoned in this dock in Santa Monica until a reporter from the Chicago Tribune newspaper found out about what had happened on board the ship and the fact that now it was totally abandoned, which seemed so creepy, and he decided to dig into this. And ultimately, he published the story that I'm telling you right now. Here's the Parai's dark secret that both Nels and Captain Goob and Sky knew all too well. 3.5 years earlier, on a night in the fall of 1903, the Parai docked in what was then called Bombay, but what is now known as Mumbai, India. And on this particular night, some of the crew members of the Parai decided they want to leave the boat and go have some fun. So a few sailors and an officer hopped on one of the rowboats on board the Parai, they lowered it down to the water, and they paddled to shore. And apparently, this group of guys had a great time on shore, but at some point, the officer apparently killed a guy on land. Who knows what it was about? Nobody knows. The reporter from the Chicago Tribune couldn't figure it out, but the rumor goes the officer killed someone. And when they came back to the ship that night, the officer was bragging about killing this person and even making jokes about it. Now, we don't know if the story actually happened, and we also don't really know if this is the seminal event that prompted what would become the dark secret of the Parai. But very shortly after that officer had killed someone, the Parai had left Mumbai and they were out at sea, and it was very cold. But then suddenly the crew remembered this warm air wafting over the boat, and then screams rang out from inside as the crew began going totally crazy. This was the first appearance of the Purai's dark secret, which sailors on board the Purai actually just referred to as the Thing. Nobody ever saw the Thing or felt the Thing or heard the Thing or heard the Thing. The only thing they experienced before all hell broke loose is a warm breeze would come across the ship. And then seconds later, it was absolute pandemonium until one of the crew members died. And this thing would basically inhabit these sailors and cause them to take their own lives. Over the next few years, more crews would join the Purai and go out to sea, and over and over and over again. This thing, the dark secret, would take over and many of the crew would end up dying. And so by the time the crew had come to port, the crew would totally mutiny and disappear. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near the ship. That was why Nels and Captain Gube and Sky were the longest-serving members on board the Purai, because they were the only ones who were willing to come back. All told, the Thing, or the dark secret of the Purai, claimed the lives of 23 sailors. 20 of them, after screaming like maniacs, suddenly just went quiet and leapt over the railing into the ocean and drowned. And the 3 others that passed away were the ship's captains, who all killed themselves. After the Purai was abandoned in Santa Monica, California, it's unclear what actually happened to it, but we know it never sailed commercially again. A quick note about our stories. They're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.